everyone, and welcome to this BCCJ webinar entitled Back to Work, Back to Better Work. My name's Alison Beale, and I'm the Director of the University of Oxford Japan office. We've got a really great panel today. So I'd like to first of all introduce our speakers. They cover a huge range of sectors. So we have Deborah Hayden, who is the Managing Director at Finsbury Japan, which is one of the UK's leading corporate communications and public relations firms. Fatim Jamamboy, who is partner at Herbert Smith Freehills in Singapore and head of the Asia Employment, Pensions and Incentives practice there. Mitsuhiro Kanada is senior consultant at Arup, the global engineering consultancy, and he also has a role as associate professor at the Tokyo University of the Arts. Richard Lyle is a senior director at Intralink, an international business development consultancy with a deep specialism in East Asia, and Jeremy Sampson, who is the managing director of Robert Walters Japan and Korea, which is one of the world's leading specialist recruitment companies. As I say, the title of today's webinar is Back to Work, Back to Better Work. We have a Q&A function on this webinar, so please send in your questions during the conversation, and we'll try and cover as much ground as we can, and there's a lot to cover. Robert Walters, Japan, I think was one of the first companies to embrace home working when the disease first started to spread. I think that was maybe in February, around late February, that they started home working. And I thought it'd be a really good way to frame today's discussion by asking Jeremy, who was one of the pioneers in our webinar series, because he actually took part in the very first webinar, BCCJ webinar that we held. So I'd like to ask Jeremy maybe if he could talk through your experiences of going into home working and then now your experience of transitioning out. Jeremy.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Alice. And I think things have definitely come a long way since we did that very first webinar back, I think around mid-March, it was actually. And yeah, at that point, yeah, we just went full remote across the office, I think from the 25th of February. So quite a long time before the state of emergency. But for us as a business then, you know, we really wanted to be quick to act and, you know, give our employees confidence that we were ahead of the game and really had their health and well-being as our top priority. And actually on that note, I'm glad that we did, because we've done a number of surveys amongst clients and candidates over the last few months. And one thing that's really come out of this is that, you know, employee engagement and satisfaction has actually been far higher with those companies that took action early. And in fact, satisfaction was more than double in the companies that took action and reacted to the situation in February compared to those that took action in March or even after the state of emergency. And you know, other interesting findings that we've had is overall 71% of employees that we surveyed, not within Robert Walters, but within our clients and candidates, were satisfied with their company's response. But interestingly, 29% of employees were actually dissatisfied with their company's response. But for us in Robert Walters, I guess I probably pointed out in the very first webinar, but you know, three key focuses for us over the last 3 months of we've continued to maintain. Number one, of course, was the health and well-being of our employees, and we haven't shifted from that. Secondly, was just around the communication, really just to ensure that we communicated everything effectively to both our own employees internally, but also externally to the market and our clients and candidates. And a big part of that also was providing a seamless service and support for our clients and candidates through this situation. And I think, yeah, we were able to transition quite effectively, and within about 2 weeks or so, it did become the new normal, really. But yeah, throughout the last few months, we've also continued to try and evolve and improve and continue to implement new technologies as we've gone. But one of the things we've tried to do is become as digital as possible. And you know, we've really tried to go digital and online in things like all of our invoicing, all of our pay slips, you know, contracts and agreements, and you know, DocuSign and programs like these are areas that we've really tried to utilize to create efficiencies in the business and just take away some of that physical work. Unfortunately, though, of course, there are some areas that still require hankos, which we haven't been able to get around as yet. Especially anything related to the government or banking related documentation. So you know, hopefully we'll see some improvements in that in the near future. And I guess, yeah, a big point I mentioned is around employee engagement, and for us, and this is something that we've really tried to focus on a lot over the last few months. And I think I probably struggled with it initially, just getting the frequent communication out to all of our employees, and with all the different tools available these days, just trying to identify one that worked and the best way and mode of communicating. So we did everything from pre-recorded videos to email communication to live webinars and town hall meetings. And yeah, eventually I think we've been able to communicate quite effectively with all the business. And the other thing that we've really tried to do is a lot of well-being activities, just to bring people together and to connect while they're all working remotely. So we've had sessions with PE with Joe, if anyone knows that. We've had online yoga sessions, online meditation sessions, and even did a counselling session with TEL, a Tokyo English Lifeline, which was really helpful just to get into a little bit about the stresses that people may be feeling and how to handle the return to the office. And then talking about the return to the office, I mean, it's something that we planned for, we talked about pretty much from the day we went remote in the first place. It's not something that we wanted to wing and just guess as we went. So it's something that the senior management team and myself, we spent a lot of time consuming information, just observing what was happening in the market, watching webinars was another one, and really just taking note of what other companies but also what other countries were doing with the return to work. So we tried to take as much as we could from all different companies, all different countries, in order to formulate our plan. I guess another important thing that we did was to conduct an employee survey, and we really wanted to sort of gauge the sentiment of our employees. How do they feel about returning to work? What concerns do they have? What have they been struggling with at home? What anxieties are they having about a return to the office? And this was really useful for us to really just gauge how the employees felt and take that into consideration when we were formulating that plan. And the plan itself, I won't go into every little detail. I think some of the other speakers will probably cover some of this off as well, but we didn't just want to rush back to the office quickly, and we have gone a really staggered and staged approach. So our plan is a 4-stage approach. With stage 3 essentially being the state of emergency. That's the office being closed and everybody working from home. So we shifted from stage 3 to stage 2 at the beginning of last week. And that's a staggered return in groups A and B, which I'll get into briefly in a moment. Stage 1, which is where we look at having most of the whole population back to the office, and that'd be followed by business as usual, which we'll come over sort of a timed period. So we're in stage 2 right now. What that looks like is the group A, group B format. I know a lot of companies are doing that, but it's very, very common. And so what we've done with the group A and B format is to really split the teams at team level, factoring in really the desk layout and the office layout. So we're trying to ensure that we maximize distancing within the office, and so that everybody has sort of space between them at the desk. And of course, we've tried to maintain flexibility for people also. So we've made a point of not forcing anyone back to the office. And of course, anyone with, who's a working parent or living with or in a high risk category, or anyone that's just genuinely uncomfortable about returning to the office, we're continuing to sort of facilitate and accommodate those people at this stage. Another important point in our planning was just having a clear trigger for if and when we go back to work from home again. So if we see a second wave, if we see cases escalating again, we have a trigger in place where we'll close the office and send everybody to work from home again. And another important step for us was just having a town hall and explaining to everybody what our plan was, what the safety protocols were, and just helping all the employees to understand our approach to returning back to the office. So I guess in summary there, what we tried to do is just ensure that we had a clear plan. It wasn't just sort of guesswork and going back roughly, but and also having a project team in place to make sure that we factored in all parts of the business. So we're in week 2 now, and so far I think it's gone quite well. Group B is in the office. I'm working from home this week, of course, and so we're trying to ensure that there's no overlap between the Group A and Group B, and of course for people's safety there. And it's also worth noting for anyone that's planning or already doing a return to the office is, most people are keen to get back, but it's important to realize that there's also a lot of anxiety still. There's people who aren't that keen and are quite concerned about coming back. So it's important to hear people like that out and make sure we're not assuming that everybody just wants to get back to it. And I think as a result of this, the employees, the expectations of employees has really changed. And, we're really seeing demand for more flexible work styles. And what used to be a selling point is really now commonplace and a necessity. So, providing flexible work and this sort of flexibility moving forward really does connect to loyalty and satisfaction of employees. So I guess in summary for Robert Walters and probably for all companies out there, I think it's really important to realize that how we reacted initially and over the last few months, how we've communicated with employees over the last few months, and the actions and things that we put in place moving forward really has had and will continue to have a direct impact on employee engagement and retention moving forward. So that's us in summary, Alison.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. And there's so many facets of that I hope we'll be able to pick out over the course of this conversation. We did actually have a question come through while you were speaking about Robert Walters. And the question was, did you already have a BCP? Because it sounds as if you were very prepared. And so, for example, did all of your employees already have equipment?
Good question. I covered this a little bit in the first webinar, but we had a BCP, but honestly, it was quite out of date. So thankfully, we had the foundations there, but we were very well set up technology-wise. We had Microsoft Surface Pros, and we had all the tools and Skype for Business and Workplace and things like that. So we had the technology there. We just didn't have the remote work or the work from home protocols in place.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And thank you, Shoko Tsuge, for the first question. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because BCPs, I think in Japan, most of our BCPs covered things like earthquake or natural disaster, and global pandemic was a bit lower down the list, maybe along with being hit by a meteor from outer space. But it seems that from what you've said, it sounds as if communications was a very key part to your success in transitioning in and out of home working. So I'd like to move on now and ask Deborah about communications in more depth. Deb, what do you think have been the major lessons learned for companies in terms of communications, both for internals and externals?
Thanks very much, Alison. Firstly, I'd just like to say, Jeremy, thank you. I'm going to put you up as my PR poster child. Communications is crucial to getting through the situation that we've been in, and I'm really hoping, as you've discovered, the depth that you need to go to, the care you need to take, that companies are going to actually realise the importance, particularly in Japan, of communicating with employees and external stakeholders, hopefully a lot more. Perhaps we can do something on the marketing effort there. We'll have to have a little sidebar conversation. I think there's been a lot of lessons learned. People, Alison, to your point, I think people had their BCPs, but it was more, what happens with the power generator and what do I do when the earthquake happens? I don't think as many people were prepared to have a fully functioning office, fully functioning, cities, fully functioning services, but be in the situation where they didn't want people to go out and about and wanted them to stay home. Many Japanese companies, I think particularly, were caught a little bit short. But what we've observed over the last few months is how quickly companies have actually beefed up and sorted things out. I know of massive, very antediluvian traditional Japanese companies that have, when they started and sort of like, oops, we've got a state of emergency here, said, right, we're going to do the right thing, everybody work from home. Sort of post-menopausal 50-year-old sort of, butchers were like, oh my God, at home, what am I going to do? Some of them didn't even have VPNs. They've now moved, they've got VPNs, everybody's got tablets, and, whether it's Microsoft or whether it's Apple or whatever, they've been able to connect, and they've found the love of video conferencing. In fact, there's a new word now called remohara, which is basically, don't harass me when I'm remote working. I don't want you to actually ask me what's that in my living room. I don't want you to ask me what I'm wearing. And I don't want to show you all those things either. The enthusiasm with which people have adopted the video conferencing is so much so that we have our new remohara. So that's something you've got to be a bit careful of. Be polite and be respectful of people's circumstances. But I think the big thing, as Jeremy pointed out, is communications. Is companies have learnt that they're not going to be judged only by their words, but also by their actions. And they have to actually communicate the care for their employees, the care and the respect for their customers. And they've got to do this again and again and again. Repetition has been, I think, one of the key points in making sure that people understand the messages. With this new way of working, I think a lot of new communications forms, rather than Butcho sitting there bellowing things out from his sort of desk at the top of the tables, he's actually had to sort of call up and have one-on-one conversations with his teams. We haven't been in an office situation and been able to actually hope that by osmosis everybody knows what's going on. We've actually had to sit down and explain and make sure and interact with colleagues across all businesses. And I think this has been a very important learning that people have come away with. Repeating messages, making sure people understand, checking in like the town halls that Jeremy's been talking about, ensuring that the teams are actually working together and functioning and actually giving the same messages to the customers. I think this has been a very important lesson for all companies.
Yeah, that's great. Deb, both you and Jeremy talked about the use of new technologies and new ways of communications. And I was just wondering, what do you think are the advantages and some of the maybe drawbacks of some of the new technologies we're using, and how that impacts on team dynamics?
I think people have struggled at the start, but gradually I think they're coming back to actually realise how to communicate in this new way. Your actions, your body language, over sort of 70% of what we say and getting our message across is actually by our body language. You know, if I'm sitting here talking to you now saying, oh, we're really excited about coming back to work, you know, immediately that actually I'm not very excited. You've got to make sure that you've got to make a double effort to make sure that you're communicating in sync with your body language, with your words, not just reading a massive speech off a PowerPoint. You've got to actually make a bigger effort to engage with your audiences. Just the simple looking at the camera rather than the picture of yourself performing actually makes it look like you're talking to the people that are watching the webinar. So there's been a lot of, I think, you know, hits and misses. I think we've all got our favorite stories of like, oops, you know, I wish the dog had come in and sort of eaten my dinner or taken my homework away sort of right when I was on the camera. I think we've all got those stories. But I think the nice thing is people have actually seen a little bit more of the humanity of their colleagues, the humanity of their bosses. This has been a time when just, you know, being a logical and straightforward sort of order maker, communication sort of driven firm hasn't actually worked. You've had to sort of bring out the empathetic side. You've had to actually reach out to people and to show that you care. Back to my earlier comment is, it's not just your words, it's actions. It's actually showing that you're putting your money where your mouth is, that you're actually giving your staff the flexibility to be able to do things differently, to try different technologies, to try different platforms. And I think they're still evolving.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Again, there's so much I'd like to kind of pull out more about that. But if I could just move over now to Fatim and just ask a little, because we've been talking about what's nice to do, and we've been talking a little bit about best practice. But could I ask you, Fatim, more about the legal aspects and where's the line between what we should be doing and what our legal responsibilities are as employers?
Never a very clean line, unfortunately. There's often some bleed and some overlap between the two areas. I think the legal impact does hit on most of the areas that everyone today is talking about. And if we think particularly or specifically, first of all, on the sustained remote working that Jeremy talked about, this idea that we might use this model of work longer term. If companies are thinking of moving to a model where employees are able to work from home more longer term, and for this to be a more permanent method of operating, that's a massive cultural shift, first of all, for Japan. And it's really heartening to hear some of these stories of how quickly some of your businesses have already been able excuse me, to transition over into that model. But the way in which we did this was very much as an emergency response. It wasn't well thought out necessarily. As Deborah mentioned, the BCPs didn't have sustained 2-month-long home working in their minds when they were written. So we need to start thinking, first of all, do your employees have the space, the setup and the safe working environment in their homes? You still owe them as an employer the general duty of care. So you do have some responsibility to have a conversation with the employee to ask whether or not they can work from home. Imposing work from home when it was mandatory due to government orders is one thing, but requiring employees to work from home longer term is going to require a conversation between the employer and the employee. One of the sore topics, one of the things that really does upset employees, and it may have come out, Jeremy, in your employee engagement survey, is as they are asked to work from home for longer and longer periods, the cost of working from home is creeping up. So should I have to buy my own printer? Should I have to buy a second screen? Or should my employer be paying for those resources that allow me to work more effectively and more productively at home? And so some of the big companies have already made very public decisions. Google announced a $1,000 grant to all employees to allow them to decide how best to use that money to set up their work from home. That's not going to be possible for every company or financially possible for every company, but at least thinking about what is the work that I'm expecting you to perform at home, and have I given you the tools and the equipment? And particularly looking at that for your lower paid staff, where the impact is obviously much more significant and meaningful, and whether that's thinking about allowances or actually physically providing equipment, providing the second screens and the printers on loan for home use. Information isn't leaking. And thirdly, in that space, the employee management piece becomes really important. How are you going to manage performance, and specifically underperformance of employees if they are working from home? It's much, much easier to have conversations face to face with employees, and the communication piece is absolutely vital. You shouldn't shy away from having the same type of performance and management conversations as you would with an employee physically present in the office, as you should if they were working remotely. So sustained working from home is going to be one area that does have some legal parameters we need to think about. The other one, of course, is if you are reopening your offices and physically requiring employees to come back into the office, there's much more legal framework around that. We've got to make sure we've got safe working spaces. So that means ensuring you've got your safe distancing measures in place, ensuring that you're providing personal protective equipment, staggering the entry into the office as far as is possible, thinking about the split team approach if that's appropriate for your business with the team A and team B segregation. So working around that piece. And that requires not just a one-off upfront investment of thinking about what needs to be done, but it also requires an ongoing commitment to ensure safety. As time goes on and employees come back into the office, it's going to be harder and harder to keep them to those strict distancing requirements in particular. The Ministry of Health and Labour and Welfare in Japan hasn't been as prescriptive as in other jurisdictions with the requirements, but you still do have this general duty of health and safety towards your employees, and you're going to have to think about making sure that the workspace is safe. And finally, that there are lots of topics, but the last one I just wanted to point out from a legal perspective is personal data. As part of the monitoring and safety measures, we're often taking temperature checks, we're asking for medical information about employees' symptoms, particularly their respiratory symptoms. You're collecting sensitive personal data. So do you have in place a proper data retention policy, and are you handling that data in accordance with the requirements? Again, what you did in the short term as an interim emergency response to the pandemic will allow you some leeway, but as these become sustained and embedded patterns going forward, we need to think a little bit more clearly to make sure that we do have compliance with our legal requirements in terms of personal data and also more broadly health and safety.
That's great, thank you. There's so much to think about. I'm afraid, I think that at least for me, you froze for part of your part of that in point 2. So please excuse me if you did cover this, but can I just ask you, we talked a little bit about how different people react very differently to going back, and what should we do if some people don't want to go back? Is there any way that we could force people, or what should we do in those sorts of situations?
Legally, there are some options, but I think before you even had that discussion about whether or not you have the legal right to force an employee back to work, I think Jeremy's point about the employee engagement and do you want to do this becomes very, very important. Understanding why the employee is reluctant to come back to work. It may be that they have underlying medical conditions, or they live with vulnerable individuals, elderly parents, or very young children, or those that are unwell. So there can be really meaningful reasons why an employee doesn't want to come back to work, and making sure that you're not just implementing a black and white hardline approach to that question. Assuming that you really feel you have to bring the employee back to work and that you don't have an option, you probably could force the employee back. You could make a reasonable and lawful direction to say you're required back into the workplace. But even when clients ask us for advice in this space, our advice is always tempered with, that's rarely going to be the right thing to do. You are better off focusing on the narrative, the communication, and the steps that will give the employee the comfort that they will be safe in your workplace, or trying to adopt measures that adapt the working environment for them, whether that's allowing them to come in late or stagger their work hours, or help them in some other way to feel confident and comfortable. But ultimately, you could probably issue a lawful direction to require them to come back to work. Japan is a very employee-friendly jurisdiction, and I don't think the courts will look particularly favourably on employers that take disciplinary action against employees in this circumstance, but there are avenues if you were so minded to consider them.
Okay, great, thank you. Mitz, I'd like to come over to you now, because what I felt over the last 3 months is that we've all developed a very different relationship to the physical environment in which we're in. So, for example, our homes, our offices, but also the kind of wider environment, our towns and cities. So can I ask you how you think this experience during the pandemic will change our relationship to our physical environment?
Right. The buildings and the cities change very slowly compared to the value that we have. I think we've seen that value changes very, very quickly, like really surprisingly quickly. Whereas built environment responds to that like a year or 2 years later. If I can show you, if I can share my screen. So back to work. Well, I should say back to office, because it's not like we have been playing, we have been working, just not from office. And in the building of the future that we might design, shown on the right, we don't have to worry about the travel to work in congested train, or whether the office air is healthy or not. But for now, I think many of us gradually, in fact, like now, in a few weeks' time, that gradually have to go back to work. Maybe not as often and as long hours as we used to be, but still. And initially we will come to an office like half empty, but half, 50-50, that in team A and B. Is that enough? Is that the right level of reduction? Or, do we need to reduce more, or we can actually have more? And air quality, HVAC. HVAC stands for heating, ventilating, and air conditioning. I know it's not a very popular office conversation subject unless you work for a company like ours. So let's take a look at what impact social distancing has on our workspace and travel. In Japan, like UK, we say 2 meter social distancing. But as you probably are aware, if you talk to your colleagues in the States, they say 6 feet, which is about 1.8 meters. So it's more or less the same. But I was surprised that in Germany, that they say 1.5 meter. I don't know why it's not 1, it's not 2, but 1.5, I think that's very German. And WHO has something completely different. But as we know that we move in the office, so it's not the 2 meter distance with tolerance that that between where we sit. But in reality, there's a sort of denser area and less denser areas. And also because we move around, the tolerance is needed. And if we actually keep 2 meter and tolerance, then that means that office population density needs to go down to 35%. So it's 1/3. So actually, if we say 50-50 or half empty office, if we want to keep 2-meter social distancing with tolerance, actually that's not enough. That's more like Germany. We are actually saying, if we say group A and group B, if everybody comes, I know that not everybody comes, but that means that we have about 45 to 50%. That's equivalent to 1.5 meter with some tolerance. So it's a little bit hard to believe that even if it's a half empty, actually we are not keeping the social distance that we set. But in reality, we all know that it's not where we sit and how far we sit, but majority of sort of time of proximity happens, when you actually go to the bathroom or go to the kitchen or whatever, so that it happens along the corridor, and it doesn't really happen uniformly, in our office. So rather than saying 2 meter or 1.5 meter or sticking to 50% or 35%, I think you should just look at your office plan and how your teams work, when they come, how they interact with each other, and how the furniture is arranged. So each office has a sort of unique condition, and you can actually establish what's the right level of the social distancing for your office. And you can rearrange your furniture, or you can rearrange the way team interacts with each other. And you don't have to do the analysis. It's a common sense. And I'm not going to bore you with the mechanical services equipment stories, but the obvious thing is that there are easy measures that you can take, and also long-term, more costly solutions that you need to adapt. And the easiest thing you can do, and maybe at home as well, if you forget everything I said today, one thing you can maybe remember is that the humidity level is something you can actually control, and the optimum to fight against not just virus, but bacteria is 40 to 60%. So that you can check at your home, at the office, and it's actually not that difficult to do for Japanese summer. It's very humid, as you know. But when the second wave comes, in later fall or beginning of winter, it's likely that outside air humidity is like 15%, 20%. So if you can remember that at home or at office, if you can humidify your workplace, it helps a little bit. And of course, there are a lot of more significant measures you can take, and many companies and also many or some office share companies are seriously addressing these issues, because people and firms care about the air quality they breathe. Because before, good indoor air quality was granted unless something smelled funny. But people now want to know the quality of the air they're breathing. And as the management, I think office management needs to address these issues and need to really be seen that they care. And of course, it's not just work or home, but of course, we most of us have to travel between work and home. And actually, many people don't want to come back to the office because they are worried about really packed. Well, it's not as packed as it used to be, but Japanese subways and trains are quite infamous for being packed like sushi. And here you don't have to, really know the details, but this is a train station with ticketing booths. And the left-hand side is just as normal, and the right-hand side is with some intervention of social distancing. And two things, as the bottom diagram shows, that you can actually make difference in terms of time of proximity by having some intervention. But of course, as the left-hand side has already finished and the right-hand side is still going on, it means that, of course, it takes longer. And it's not just at the station, but it's at the entrance lobby of your office, or when you come out of an elevator, or when you are waiting for elevator for lunchtime or something like that. So same thing happens. And of course, we cannot completely change it, but you can actually make some intervention to make it better. So, as I said in the beginning, that the physical environment takes time to change, but the value we have changes quite quickly. Like if you have an office in a high-rise building, higher floors are more premium and more expensive, but that might change. Maybe the ground floor or when easy access by escalator, the sort of lower parts might have more premium. And now the open plan office is quite popular, and I think many offices adapt hot desking, but that might change. Maybe we are back to cubicles, and people wanting to work in a different office conditions, and that will change the city, suburban, countryside where we live and work, and that will gradually sort of sink into the design of our new generation buildings and cities. So I think the value change first, and built environment responds to that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. That's really interesting, and there's lots again to think about. I mean, you talked. What came across through your presentation is that there's lots that can be done, and that can be done to make the place safer. And I think this links to a question that we've actually just that's come in through the audience, which is to Fatim, which is, what's the ultimate responsibility of employers to ensure safety at the workplace?
You have a general duty of health and safety, and how that specifically applies in any given circumstance, it depends on the circumstances. So in light of COVID-19, there are specific measures about safe distancing and ensuring your employees have access to personal protective equipment, so hand sanitizers and face masks. But those are the very sort of specific and immediate responses that have come out from COVID-19. There sits above that the broader duty of health and safety towards an employee, and not just employees, but any visitors, contractors, or other people that are on your premises. You'll have occupiers' duties as well. So we have to think about this not just in terms of the short-term issues that arise out of COVID-19, but more longer term. How are we going to make sure that our workplaces are safe, that we are not putting employees at risk of being able to contract a contagious virus just because they have chosen to come to work? So that is the general duty on the employer. They are going to have to address that duty by making sure that obviously we implement the safe distancing, but you can't control the safe distancing that you've just seen on the transport links on the way into your office. So that's going to require you to think more broadly, not about health and safety, but more broadly about access to workplace and sustained remote working practices. So it's a really big duty, and it does lie on the shoulders of the employers to make sure that anyone coming into their building, and specifically their employees, are able to perform the work you're expecting of them without the risk of contracting the virus from their fellow employees or others on the premises as well.
Great, thank you. Mitz, in the last, over the last very many years, there's been a move from people generally from countryside to cities, and this has happened in all sorts of countries, from developed countries, developing countries. But now we're all starting to homework, and maybe cities are not looking as attractive if they're very crowded and potential to contract disease. So do you think this will have a long-term effect on where people live, and will people want to move more out to live into the countryside, do you think, in future?
I think so. Of course, it depends on the countries and the level of development. In underdeveloped countries, still the movement to the cities will definitely continue. So as sort of us as a whole, we will still see urbanization as the main issue. But in developed countries like Japan or UK, I think many people will question the value of living close to work, or going to the work in the city center. And I clearly sort of remember that my friend living in a sort of remote countryside near Sendai, and I asked him how he's doing, and he said, "Oh, I have a river in front of my house, and I have I can make a fire, and I can have I have food, and you guys look pretty bad in Tokyo." And I thought, okay, maybe it's true that it's actually much not just safer, but it's actually richer lifestyle in the countryside. And I think many people have realized that. And well, people knew that, but people felt that they didn't have choice. But I guess, now we know that we do.
Yeah, it's true. It'll be really interesting to see how this all evolves in future and how it changes us maybe permanently. So thank you, Mitsu from Arup. So Richard, I'd like to turn to you now, because we've been talking about the new ways of working over the last 3 months. And in a sense, we've been kind of in crisis mode, thinking about how to survive and how to protect our businesses. And now that we're coming out of that phase, we're looking forward more to how do we sustain work with these new changed realities. So can I ask you, Richard of Intralink, can I ask for your insight into the most effective way to conduct business given the new normal of working practices?
Yeah, thank you, Alison, for that. Japan, meetings without face-to-face, now there's a conundrum, right? If you're not face-to-face, you can't have a meeting. I think the last few months, we've actually proved that's wrong. So I'd like to talk about some of the experiences we've had. As you mentioned, we're a business development consultancy, so our business is about meetings, it's about meeting customers, it's about obviously meeting with our clients and so forth. So face-to-face is really a key aspect of our business and the core of our business, but we're not unique, of course, in that respect. So for us, with the sort of the state of emergency and the working from home, we obviously we couldn't meet people face to face, for obvious reasons. So we had to move very quickly to what we call the virtual meeting. Meeting people either online over WebEx or Zoom or whatever. It's fair to say, of course, with international business, the WebEx has been around for years on client calls and weekly calls with the States and Europe. We use Skype or Zoom the whole time to talk to our clients. But here in Japan, we're always meeting our customers face to face. So I think culturally, there's differences there. So the UK is much more used to sort of doing stuff online, meeting online, whereas Japan wasn't, but is of course is changing. That is changing now. And then we've heard talk about the large corporations and SMEs. Definitely, I think in Japan, you see a big difference there. The large corporations, it's very, the word katai in Japanese, very sort of rigid, really springs to mind. There's certain things they can and can't do in terms of they can't use Zoom, but they can use Teams, or they can only use Business for Skype, which is a nightmare to use, as we've all experienced, for example. Those sort of things. They're not in the office, so they can't sign an NDA or whatever. There's all those sort of things we've had to deal with. But anyway, I think we've seen that generally smaller organizations in Japan have been quicker to adapt and easier to sort of to work with, where some of the large corporations have been a bit more challenging to actually move to those virtual meetings. I think what we've also found anecdotally is probably a couple of things I'd like to talk about. There's people we have existing relationships with, and then there's people we're meeting for the first time. For people we have existing relationships with, we found it's quite easy to actually encourage them to do the virtual meeting, because we've met them in person, we've exchanged business cards in person, so we actually have a relationship with those people. So the virtual meeting hasn't been too difficult to sort of continue that relationship online rather than face to face. With new people, though, that has been a challenge. I think in the first, when state of emergency was happening, what we found was a lot of companies just pushed it out. They said, look, once the state of emergency is finished and we're back to face, let's do a meeting then. What we've seen in June, interestingly, is they've realized that the new norm, is not the old norm. So what we found is actually those companies are now responding more to virtual meetings. So we've had, first meetings with people we've never met before virtually, which there's definitely been a change there. And I think also what has worked very well is when you have a meeting, you start with video footage so that everyone can see people. So you don't have the face-to-face, but you've got at least faces on a screen that you're sort of looking at and talking to. and so forth, and then maybe turn off your video and go into presentation or so forth. So you have some aspect of face-to-face still exists. And actually we found with our clients for years, we did calls with them where we would just have voice. Now actually we do video calls with a lot of our clients, and so we can actually see them. And I think we found actually it's improved our relationships with our clients overseas because we're seeing them more regularly, or not in person, but on a weekly call over Zoom or whatever. I sort of touched on it a little bit earlier. Of course, there's a whole lot of platforms that you can use for the virtual meeting. I think there's no secrets here. Everyone knows Zoom just works. And then Skype for Business doesn't work. Sorry to, I don't want to trash Microsoft, but Skype for Business just hasn't worked for a lot of people we talk to. Microsoft Teams is a bit hit and miss. And then you've got, other sort of WebEx platforms. But I think what we found is if companies can allow it, Zoom just works and you can do it. So we start with that. And then there's ways around things. So if companies don't allow Zoom, perhaps you can offer telephone numbers where they can call into Zoom. So they can use a telephone line rather than sort of the online platform if their IT system doesn't allow that, for example. And then we found obviously there's technical issues. So I think Japan is generally getting better. When we first started, we'd find a lot of calls where, oh, where's Tanaka-san? Oh, call him up. Oh yeah, what button do I press? How do I get on? All those sort of things. I think Japanese companies are now getting more used to that. So there's less technical issues, but I think on every call, usually there's some hiccup here or there. And so we found that backup plans are quite good. So set up a Zoom call, but just in case have a team set on in the background, just in case things don't work properly. And I guess finally, I'd like to just touch on sort of making sure that virtual meeting runs well. So that's where the setup is really key. And in some ways, it's probably no difference from a face-to-face meeting. So having a very clear agenda and sharing that agenda prior to the meeting to make sure that it's clear what's going to be discussed in the meeting. So that's, that's no different from face-to-face, but I think in the virtual meeting, it's really critical. So everyone's very clear what's happening. It's introductions and it's, talk about your business and talk about our business and Q&A. Even at that level, it still helps to sort of the flow of the event. And also it's often difficult to understand who's on the call and from the customer side. So that's again where you can preempt things. Japan loves to be organized. They love all that sort of stuff. The pre-meeting to talk about the meeting, the post-meeting. So the pre-meeting now is an email beforehand. Who's coming to the meeting? What are their roles? What are their names? What are they going to talk about? You can do all that over email, and Japan loves that because it shows that you're sort of responding to customer needs. You're sort of, you're understanding their issues. So by the time of that virtual call, it's very clear. Okay, today we have Tanaka-san, Yamada-san, and Sato-san, and then Tanaka-san's butcher. So he's the person we want to sort of wow with whatever we're talking about. And then, making sure that on your side, there's someone clearly in control of the agenda, clearly in control of the flow of things, so that you're not sort of stumbling around. The presentation finishes and then there's a silence. Because I think in face-to-face, silence is golden, as they say in Japan. I think in the virtual space, unfortunately, silence is hell. And 5 seconds of silence feels like 5 hours of hell online. So having someone very clearly on your side leading the call and making sure that it's clear, and if there is a gap, Tanaka-san, it's your turn now to sort of present on the company. Please, can you go ahead? Oh, Tanaka-san, your connection's faulty. Can Sato-san do it in terms instead of you, for example? So that's a long way of saying I think we have moved from face-to-face to virtual. And now, funnily enough, a lot of Japanese companies, we thought we'd be straight back to face-to-face. Most of our meetings this month have still been virtual, are continuing to be virtual, and so we're now offering companies, and to the point about people feeling comfortable, which has been a very key theme, I think, of today's talk. We actually offer companies, we'd like to meet you next week. We're very happy to come and meet, your offices, but if you feel more comfortable, we can do it over virtual if you want. And we found that's worked very, very well indeed. And still quite a few of our meetings are virtual. I think we have had some face-to-face meetings from the beginning of June, but I would say probably at the moment it's it's a 80-20 split, or maybe 90-10 split, but we're seeing it's gradually moving back to more face-to-face, I would say. So thank you. Yes, I think virtual is working in Japan. It still has its challenges, but as long as you just follow common sense, I think we found that you can still get very meaningful meetings and business can move forward. We still close deals in this period of time, and we will continue to close deals as we move forward as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and people certainly are very loyal to their platforms, aren't they? People either love Zoom or they love Microsoft
Yes.
Teams in kind of equal measure, I think. So I wanted to ask a little bit about kind of relationship building, because of course in Japan a lot of relationship building sometimes takes place outside the office or maybe in more social settings. So is there any way to replicate that kind of interaction, do you think?
Yes, well, so we've had a few sort of new Japanese phrases that have come to life during this period, and so the on-nomi, I think is the expression that they use for an online nomikai. So we have, as a company, done that. So I think to Jeremy's point about communication with your colleagues, we found that yes, absolutely, we need to, because we don't have the FaceTime in the office, we need to have that. So we've done a few on-nomi sessions with our colleagues on a Friday evening, relax over at home over a beer or two or a soft drink. We haven't got to that stage yet with the Japanese companies, I guess I'm still considering how we would do that. I still think that's going to be a bit of a challenging one. And Japan, when you want to when you're in the last stages of closing a deal, often it is, when you get to the nomikai, when you get to the stages where they want to take you out for dinner, that is obviously quite an important part still. So I think that's still TBD, I would say, not trying to want to not answer that question. But I think, yes, to perhaps the point I'd like to make is virtual works, but actually what it doesn't do is, going around, so during a meeting, going outside with, if you still smoke, that is, with, the butcher to sort of talk about that, or, sort of socializing outside of the meeting, what I'm trying to say. So what the virtual meeting does miss is that sort of in the corridor, speaking to someone to sort of understand what they're really thinking, what's really going on. So I think we still have to sort of explore how that's going to work. So I think that's still perhaps the next stage of the evolution of the virtual meeting, how we would do that. And possibly that's a sort of a one-to-one virtual meeting with the butcher after the meeting to say, Sato-san, how do you feel the meeting went? What's going on your side? What can we do to help you sort of move this forward, for example? So perhaps that's the next evolution of this, that it's the after meeting isn't, the walk to the elevator after the meeting or in the lobby. It's a sort of a quick call one-to-one with whoever to sort of really get their feeling, the hand, of how the meeting went, for example.
Really interesting. We don't have much time left and we've got a lot of really great questions. So now I'd like to open up to some of the questions that have come in. And Jeremy, we've got a question for you, first of all. So we've got a question about how you're managing employee productivity in your company. And as a follow-up, maybe Deb and Fatima, could you maybe comment after Jeremy about any communications or legal issues around managing poorly performing staff? Jeremy, do you want to have a go first at that?
Sure, absolutely. It's been something that we've been looking at quite closely over the last few months. But it's interesting too, because if we look at productivity now, I mean, the activities that we're seeing in the market and that we're expecting of our employees is very different to what it would have been 3 or 6 months ago. The reality is that the market has shifted, the recruitment market has shifted, less companies are hiring, and so the productivity levels probably can't be expected to be what they were in a boom market, that's for sure. But one thing for us that is really important, I mean, firstly, it's just understanding expectations. I think everybody across the business understands what the expectations are, say in terms of their own individual productivity, and we're a business that measures on results and output more so than say presence, and so everybody understands what their output is, what's required, and productivity is probably managed more at the team level. more so than say myself overall across the business. So, and it really depends on functions also. So the productivity of, say, our accounting and finance department may be measured very, very differently compared to what our consultants' output might be when it comes to recruiting activity. So I think just ensuring that everybody understands exactly what the targets are, what the productivity levels are expected. There's also full visibility across the business, so people can compare their own productivity to colleagues across the business. So, and that creates an element of accountability there also. And as I said, it really just breaking it down to team level also.
Great, thank you. Deb, do you have anything to add on to that?
Oh, just very quickly, poor performers that were poor performers before we had the situation are probably likely to be struggling in this new dynamic, whatever we want to call it. And I think the big thing is, don't put square pegs in round holes, pay to people's strengths. And I think, as we've all established, is individual communication with employees, working with them as we move to a focus on, as Jeremy mentioned, outputs rather than just being there, and really talking them through issues and challenges. I'll leave it to Fatim to talk about the ways to perhaps suggest that poorly performing employees could actually, be happier somewhere else. But as Jeremy pointed out, it's going to be a tough environment at the moment, and people will be wanting to hold on to their jobs. So we as employees and employers as the first instance owe it to help poorly performing employees find a way to be slightly more successful. Fatim, over to you for the legal comments.
I think that's spot on, Deborah. We are expecting to see a rise in litigation in the more employee-friendly jurisdictions. And Japan is a good example of that. It's never been particularly easy in Japan to discipline, and certainly not to terminate employment of employees. And that's only going to be more difficult if you're having to do that whole process remotely. I think the start of that conversation has to be the expectations. So both as an employer more broadly, but specifically the manager managing the employee, setting expectations not only on output, which is sometimes objectively measurable through productivity metrics, but also the expectation on how I want you to work whilst you are remotely working. Am I expecting you to be present for the whole day at a desk? Am I expecting you to answer your phone quicker, or is it Skype messages, or is it email? How do you want to connect and interact with me whilst I'm in my home environment, which is of course necessarily very different to being in the work environment? You're losing the sort of accidental communication, that bumping into people in the corridors or seeing them in the pantry. You're missing that opportunity to have interaction and connection. And sometimes it can be very difficult if the only communication you're getting with your manager is the request to do work and then the critique of that work. So we need to make sure that we're filling that gap in with some more connection and communication, and really being very, very clear about what we expect. But if they are a poor performing employee, they're a poor performing employee, and you're going to have to grapple with that performance improvement process with them. As I said from the outset, that's never been easy, and it's not going to be any easier, but you can still, and you shouldn't not address poor performing employees just because they're working remotely. You should be having the conversations. You should be thinking about whether it's time to escalate and put them onto a formal performance improvement plan. And if so, just being mindful that your check-ins or the way in which you would ordinarily catch up with the employee need to be really thought about very, very carefully. Trying to use video more than just audio or email, where sometimes the message is not fully understood or construed. Seeing if you can pick up some clues. Are there particular reasons why? Is this employee really struggling to work from home? Is this employee facing really difficult challenges? We know for many employees who are working from home, they're suddenly faced with the environment of having young children at home for whom they might then be primarily responsible. Elderly parents who again they might have to also be responsible for. It can be very difficult to do your normal job if your surroundings aren't conducive to that. So thinking about that as well. I think if you do take disciplinary action against employees during this period, you have to make sure that you have tempered that decision to take into account these exceptional circumstances, and make sure that really the decision that you are taking is not just in the abstract appropriate for this poor performing employee, but is appropriate in the context of the world in which we're currently living. So I think there has to be a little bit of flexibility and adapting around the edges there. But the key message has got to be, if you've got a poor performing employee, you do have to address it and take them through the same process that you would have done had you been back in the offices.
Great, yeah. And I think you made a really important point that it is difficult working in this kind of new environment. So that leads on to a question that's come in on how new incoming employees can effectively integrate with a long-standing team, because obviously this has happened over April, which is traditionally a time when a lot of new members join the teams in Japan. So any quick thoughts, because I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but this is an interesting question. So any quick thoughts on, as a team, how do you establish trust and affiliation in this kind of environment? Does anyone want to take that?
I think this has to be very carefully managed, and a process needs to be put in place, because these new employees must not feel as though they're left out by themselves. Many companies we work with have set up very strict mentoring systems where each individual new employee has a sort of, more experienced, or sometimes even 2 or 3 mentors to actually take them through the various processes. Regular check-ins on a daily basis, making sure that they've got tasks and things to read, to look at, and a place to go to, and then very regular check-ins with the mentors. It's very challenging. Not everyone's going to find it works, but if you have a good system in place and very, very clear protocols, chances are that you will be able to start slowly bringing a new employee into the system.
Could I just add, we've actually had 2 employees come on in this period, and I would agree with all that Deb has said. Communication has been absolutely vital. And in fact, one of our employees in his first week, he secured a whole lot of meetings. So he's shown that it can work and be successful. But yes, I think communication is really critical. And that's where the daily check-ins is really important. And then we just take them through the normal processes of onboarding and induction and stuff. And it's just not face-to-face. It's over Zoom or whatever. So the normal processes, but with some extra TLC, definitely. That's what I would say. But it's worked. It's been a new experience for us, but we found it has worked, of course.
Great. I'd love to carry on for much longer, but we've run out of time. I'd just like to ask one final question, one thought from each of you, a little challenge. So the title of this session was Back to Work, Back to Better Work. So final, very quick piece of advice from each of you about how do we ensure that going back we are actually going back to better work. Who wants to start?
I'll kick off. Flexibility. Allowing your employees a lot more freedom to be able to choose how they want to work and how they want to interact with you. It could be flexible commuting, it could be work from home, and I think going forward most companies are going to adopt some form of this. Interestingly, a survey I saw recently said over 90% of Japanese people surveyed in Japan wanted some form of work from home, whether 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and finding a way to make that work.
Yeah, and I'd second what Deborah said there also. I think all of us have learnt so much, and our businesses have adapted so much over the last few months. So to revert back to the old ways when we go back would be a huge mistake. So, maintaining and employing that flexibility long term that's going to really engage and retain those employees.
Yeah. I was going to add diversity to what Deborah said, that Japan's lacks diversity. And now our current conditions really forces us to adapt to different conditions. And as Jeremy was saying, that majority of people will go back, but some of us will stick to a new way. And as a group, I think we will be more diverse and stronger. So if we can be a little bit sort of forgiving to people being different, and I think that's hopefully make the workplace better.
Yeah, and probably it's a bit of repetition, but I would say, obviously we've canvassed staff as to, what's worked well in this situation. So we plan to continue that. So actually going forward, you know, pick up on some of the good things we've learned, more flexibility about working from home as well. For us, you know, basically, as long as the work's being done, whether it's in the office or at home, we will continue with that. So I think it's just taking what we've learned from this and improving on it. Yeah.
I'd say you've got to listen to your employees. Obviously, this period has had a massive impact on businesses, but it's also had a tremendous personal impact on employees. And if we're trying to go back to the old way of thinking, it's just not going to work anymore. Things have changed, things have moved on. So you're going to need to talk to your employees, understand them, and really change the workplaces in a way that allows them to flourish.
That's great. Thank you so much. You've been a really excellent panel. I've really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you to all of our speakers today. And thank you also to everyone in the audience. You sent through some really interesting questions that have really helped make this conversation very rich. I'm sorry if we haven't been able to cover all of your questions, but at BCCJ, we're going to try and ensure that our webinars in future cover all of these issues in great detail. So please keep an eye out on the upcoming webinars, and please continue to take part. But just thank you everyone, and hope to see you all soon at a future webinar.